Thank you so much for having me. I'm Tim Vollmer. I work with Creative Commons. Creative Commons is a global nonprofit organization, and we develop free legal and technology tools to help content creators share their creative works on more open terms than all rights-reserved copyright. I want to talk a little bit about public access to publicly funded resources in general, and talk a little bit about the growing kind of movement around open access to scholarly research, and also open access to educational resources, and talk about a little bit from the US perspective how governments are beginning to internalize and operationalize these movements using Creative Commons legal tools. Well, I guess we're getting 2 slides here, but that's okay. I guess we can talk about access to information from a variety of different angles. One, obviously, to increase transparency. Another, to improve sort of efficiency of how government works. Another, to boost economic activity and create jobs. One for kind of an international diplomatic sort of angle, global information sharing, I guess. And finally, from kind of a civic participation angle, getting citizens involved and actually getting feedback from citizens about how governments run. Now, what I'm going to talk about is, I guess, combines a little bit of all of these things. But I guess one interesting point is that it's public access to publicly funded resources is not talking strictly from a historically transparency angle. Where we're seeing a lot of movement and where governments are using legal tools like Creative Commons is for the massive amount of information that they want to share and are looking for new innovative tools to better serve that. So I'm also going to focus strictly on the United States because we could look at state level, we could look at city level, but we would be here all day. And the US is really interesting, especially with regard to its copyright law, because it has a specific provision that says any information created by federal government employees is automatically in the public domain, which means anyone can use it for any reason without having to ask permission. This is pretty unique, and it's also created a huge boon in terms of economic activity. So certain agencies, such as the NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, release all their weather data directly into the public domain. And this has actually created a huge return on investment for the meteorological businesses and weather agencies around the world, because they can use this information and data for free without having to pay anything and without having to get a license. Also other things such as OMB Circular A133, which says that federal agencies must share information widely, they must do it within a reasonable amount of time, they have to share it broadly, such as on the web, and in other venues such as public libraries. And then of course we have things like data.gov, which are huge national repositories of data, which have actually been a great sort of example for other nations around the world as well. So we have copyright law, we have regulatory policy, we have data repositories. What else? So what we're seeing today is kind of new innovative public policy solutions, primarily aligned with the idea of funding mandates. So I'm going to talk a little bit about public access to publicly funded science and public access to publicly funded educational and training materials. First, let's take a look at public access to publicly funded science. And to give you a sense of the scale of what this looks like in the United States, the federal government spends over $60 billion in research every year. And it's through federal agencies that you might expect, like the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Department of Agriculture, Environmental Protection Agency. The NIH alone spends $30 billion in medical research, and they produce over 65,000 peer-reviewed articles every year. So even though the public is funding a lot of this content, it still has relatively poor access to it, and partly this is a consequence of how the traditional publishing industry kind of works. And I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with it. I guess it may be just a little recap in the slide on the left here, is that especially in the science realms, researchers apply for funding through federal agencies, get funding to conduct research and write articles, submit those articles to commercial journals, who then farm out the peer review to other scientists who do it for free. And then some of the articles are published, and then those journals sell back access to the articles to universities through the university libraries. It's very expensive, and the access is limited, and publishers make a lot of money. Upwards of 36% profit margin is what Elsevier reported last year. So you can see we're paying for this content several times over, and we're getting very kind of poor access around it. So the open access movement has been a kind of response to this. And when I say open access literature, I'm talking about digital online literature that's free of charge and free of most copyright restrictions. And the NIH public access policy, which was passed in 2005, probably comes closest to what we're talking about when we talk about open access. And the NIH public access policy says that any researcher who gets money from NIH, any article that comes out of your research that's published in a journal has to be deposited in the NIH depository within 1 year. And this has actually proven very, very successful in increasing access after an embargo to this content. And open access literature is beneficial because it just increases access in general and makes it more affordable. There's been some studies where it actually increases citation count because more people can actually read those journals. It's useful for what's called unexpected reading. So sometimes people can find novel approaches, novel solutions to problems, and those people aren't coming from the specific discipline. So by opening access to all of that, you kind of help crowdsource some of these problems. And also the content in NIH is available for text and data mining and other new sort of modes of research. And this has been very important. I want to talk about two things that are going on in the US most recently. One is legislation that's been introduced in both the House and Senate. It's called FASTER, which is the Fair Access to Science and Technology Research Act. And it's pretty interesting because it would essentially make an NIH public access policy on steroids. It would expand the NIH access policy to 11 different federal agencies. Any agency that spends over $100 million in research every year. And it's actually more progressive than the NIH policy because it says anyone who takes money from NSF or these other agencies must deposit their peer-reviewed journal articles within 6 months in a federal repository. So it's a little bit more progressive. The White House has actually come out with a directive which is similar to the legislation. It's called the White House Public Access Policy. The details are primarily the same, except the White House policy would allow a 12-month embargo instead of a 6-month embargo. The White House policy also addresses data sets that are being created with federal funds. So it kind of directs researchers to help make that data available, not just the articles that are coming out of it. The next thing we want to talk about briefly is open educational resources. And open educational resources is along the same lines as open access, essentially creating legal access to publicly funded educational content and training materials. One innovative program that's going on in the US right now is through the Department of Labor. And they've essentially created a $2 billion fund for the creation of course content at community colleges. And part of this is to increase completion rates, to get people back to work as a result of the financial crisis. And the innovative component of this grant program is that any new digital materials that created must be licensed under a Creative Commons attribution license. So not only does the public get free access to the content is available under an open license so that the public knows what they can do with it. The rights are clear. On the right, just wanted to explain a little bit how the CC license works and why it can be important. CC licenses operate on top of copyright, so the creators of those educational courses retain copyright, but then they must license the content under a CC license. And the CC license has 3 components to it. A lawyer-readable version, which is enforceable in court, human-readable version, which is composed of a series of icons and kind of understandable text about what you can and can't do with that content. And then also a metadata version, which makes the open resources searchable on sites like Google. So by attaching the CC BY license, it's really a boon for not only the people who create the content, because they're ensured that they get attributed as the authors of the content, but also makes it crystal clear what end users can do with that content. So these public policies are not only going on in the United States, it's happening all around the world. It's happening in the UK, who have passed a policy whereby any research funds that goes through the research councils has to be made available under a Creative Commons attribution license. It's happening at the European Commission level, who have voiced support for open access to scientific research. It's happening in Japan, who are creating open data repositories using open licenses. It's happening in Poland, who are passing open textbook legislation. And also it's happening in places like Australia and New Zealand, who've taken a really innovative approach in basically setting a default for any public sector information that their governments are funding, saying it has to be made available openly under an open license. Thank you.